So my name is Marina Richardson. I'm a researcher at Griffith University working with Dr. Rod Connolly. And today I'll be talking to you about our mapping project, NESP Project 4.13, Mapping Australia's Tropical Oyster Reefs. And I just want to take this opportunity to acknowledge all of the really wonderful collaborators who we have had join this project. It's been really great to see how well received this work has been, and I'm really looking forward to sharing some of these preliminary findings with you. Oh, come on. There we go. I'd just like to first take this opportunity to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands in which we're all meeting from today. And I pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging, and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people today. So for today's talk, I will be going a little bit into the project background, just to give a bit of context as to why this project is so important, the mapping methods that we used, and some of those preliminary results. I'll then go into some detail about an IUCN Red List assessment that we conducted for rock oyster reefs in Queensland. And then I will touch on subtitle reef building species, and then finish up talking about future directions. So what is the point of mapping tropical oyster reefs? Hopefully by now, oyster reefs have had a little bit of a time to shine, and we can all understand that they are incredibly important marine ecosystems. They protect our shorelines, they act as nature's kidneys by filtering waterways, and they provide habitat for marine species. However, very few tropical oyster reefs have been studied globally, and this makes understanding their ecology and conservation needs really difficult. And to complicate this further, tropical oyster reefs are actually ecologically unique to temperate oyster reefs. So this means that a lot of the conservation knowledge that has been developed for temperate oyster reefs is not always directly transferable to the tropics. And finally, mapping efforts globally are virtually non-existent for tropical oyster reefs. You can see pretty clearly here in this image from Beck et al., which was published in 2011. Very little mapping has been conducted since this paper. And this is why this project is so critical for the conservation of tropical oyster reefs. The specific aims of this project were first to map historical oyster reefs, present and historical oyster reefs across tropical Australia. We wanted to assess whether there have been declines in oyster reefs, and then we wanted to characterise oyster reef attributes to facilitate rapid assessments. And just to note here that although all reef building shellfish were targeted in this mapping work, I will primarily be talking about rock oysters belonging to the genus Secostria, and this is simply because they are by far the most common reef types in Northern Australia. Sorry. Okay, so before we started this mapping project, we actually needed to define what an oyster reef was so that we knew what it was we were mapping. Otherwise, we could potentially be spending the next 20 years mapping every oyster in the tropics. So we defined an oyster reef as an area with high densities of multiple size classes of living oysters. This is really important because it shows evidence of intergenerational accretion. They need to be the primary physical feature in the seascape, and there also needs to be evidence of dead shell accretion. The reef area needs to be at least 10 metres squared and needs to have at least 25% reef coverage. And for consolidated substrates, there is an additional condition that the layer of oysters needs to be greater than 2 oysters in thickness. We didn't just come up with this definition on our own. This definition was based on existing definitions for rock oyster reefs for Australian flat oysters, Sydney rock oysters, and the European flat oyster. So here we have some examples of reefs and non-reefs. The top three pretty clearly meet our definition. The reef in the bottom left photo, even though this is only a layer of oysters that's 2 in thickness, it is considered to be a reef because it's occurring entirely on soft sediment, not on a consolidated substrate. Whereas we can see these next 2 reefs, they do not meet the definitions of an oyster reef. So the bottom middle image is because the layer of oysters was 2 or less in thickness on a consolidated substrate, while the image on the bottom right is less than 25% reef cover. So once we had our definition, we began mapping, and the primary data source we used was satellite imagery. In Queensland, this was through Queensland Globe, where there's really good high-resolution satellite imagery. And then in the Northern Territory and Western Australia, we used Google Earth. This data was then supplemented with reefs located via Ozfish Unlimited Great Shellfish Hunt, and also literature and iNaturalist. And here are some examples of oyster reef signatures that we typically see in satellite imagery. The most common type I like to call, they sort of look like these bubbler crab sandballs. The next, we have this starry night pattern, and this tends to be pretty typical of reefs that are much more sort of like patchier in their size and structure. And then finally, we have these little cauliflowers or flocks of sheep, and this tends to be quite typical in hotter tropical areas where the oysters tend to be a lot paler in their coloration. So to confirm whether our search methods were actually working, in 2024, we ground truthed 15 sites that were identified by a Queensland Globe. And these were all confirmed to be extensive oyster reef ecosystems. And this is in addition to the 3 reefs that were previously shown on those slides. And we found that a minimum resolution of about 20 centimetres per pixel is needed to reliably locate reefs. This is challenging when it comes to the Northern Territory and Western Australia, where we just don't have this level of resolution. So to get around this, we collated Google Earth imagery of validated Queensland reefs to see what their signature looked like. And pretty consistently compared to surrounding substrates, whether that be soft sediment, rock, or anything else, the oyster reefs tended to be to sort of appear quite light in colour. So this is the signature that we were looking for. So when this project started, I was a little bit nervous because I really didn't know how many reefs we would expect to find, but it's fair to say that we were very pleasantly surprised. Here is our map of Australia. And in Western Australia, so far, we have found 49 reefs. In the Northern Territory, we have found 47 reefs. And in Queensland, we have found 168 reefs. And the sheer number that we have found here is clearly reflective of the better resolution satellite imagery that we have available in the state. So this is a grand total so far. We are still in the process of looking of 264 reefs, which, yeah, we're very excited by. So because we have a pretty comprehensive data set of present reefs in Queensland, we wanted to assess the decline of rock oysters belonging to the species Sarcostria in tropical Queensland. In order to do this, we needed to locate historical oyster reefs. So we searched for archived newspaper articles by looking up the terms oyster beds and oyster reefs. And this data was supplemented with literature, so looking for evidence of reef-building shellfish in archaeological shell middens, and also oyster place names. And these were the methods that were used by Gillies et al. To assess, to complete a red list assessment of both Sydney rock oyster reefs and Australian flat oyster reefs in Australia. So once we had this past and present data, we were able to complete the red list of ecosystems assessment. We were only able to do this between Cairns in the north and Busted Head in the south. And this is simply because we did not have enough historical data in these regions to facilitate an assessment. So a red list assessment assesses 5 criteria: geographic distribution, geographic extent, environmental degradation, disruption of biotic processes, and quantitative analysis. We were only able to assess criterion A, B, and C, and this is simply because for criterion D and E, there's just really a lack of research in this area, both nationally and internationally. So for now, these criterion are considered to be data deficient, and hopefully, as this field of research expands, we can include these in the assessment. But at least for now, we've estimated between Cairns and Busted Head about a 63% decline in oyster reef locations. And for each of the criterion that we did assess, each one ended up with the highest ranking of. So there's clearly a need for the protection, restoration, and threatened ecosystem listing of tropical oyster reefs in Queensland. And this work is currently under review. So yeah, hopefully this will be published soon and we can share this work around. And unfortunately, due to a lack of historical records in Western Queensland, the Northern Territory and Western Australia, we were unable to currently do any red list assessments in these areas. So to just give an example of this, on the left we have our historical shellfish reef in the Northern Territory, and we can see that a lot of these records are really concentrated around the Darwin region, which when we're looking for old newspaper articles, this makes sense. And the few other records have come from archaeological middens. So if we were just to look at these maps and make an assessment, it would look like there has been a massive increase in reefs, which maybe there has been, but yeah, it's really just pretty reflective of we don't have enough information currently to complete an assessment. So to improve mapping efforts, we will be doing a little bit more work. So when we first started this project, Eric Lowry did help us trial Sentinel-2 to map reefs, but unfortunately the resolution was too coarse, and at the time we knew of too few reefs to reliably test and use this method. When suspected reefs were located, we were having to sort of manually validate everything anyway, so it was literally just easier to manually scan the entire coastline. But now that we have mapped so many reefs, we can actually reliably extract spatial attribute data to improve mapping efforts. Our next steps will be to derive tidal plane and exposure attributes from Queensland oyster reefs in order to map areas where reefs are likely to occur in the Northern Territory. And the reason we're able to do this in the Northern Territory is because the reef building species in this state is Secostria lineage B, which is the same as the primary reef building species in Queensland. Whereas once we move over to Western Australia, the primary reef building species is Secostria lineage A, and we just know nothing about the ecology of this species, so we really can't assume that it's the same as this lineage B. And then finally, we can also apply, so by extracting these spatial attributes and applying it to Queensland, we can look for any reefs that we might have missed and also areas that would likely be suitable for restoration in Queensland. So the image on the left is an example of the exposure analysis that we're planning to do, where you can see the length of the lines coming out from a given point will give a value, and that will essentially determine how exposed or protected a site is. The middle image here, these are polygons that I have created for some of our reefs in the Gladstone region. And then by comparing it to this intertidal Sentinel-2 data, you can see that there's they really are occurring in this kind of Goldilocks green zone. So this is the kind of intertidal layer that we'll sort of be looking at. And a critical component of conserving an ecosystem is an species creates that ecosystem. And as I briefly just touched on, that is really, really challenging when it comes to oysters. I can't see the chat at all, so I'm just putting this out there if anyone feels like putting anything in the chat. I don't know if anyone wants to read out some of the answers, but I just wanted to ask everyone how many species they think are pictured here. I'm just going to assume people are putting in the chat because I can't see anything. But it is just one species. So this is just an example here of how insanely difficult identifying oysters visually is. These are all examples of Secostria lineage B, the primary reef building species that we have in Queensland. So molecular work clearly is essential for species identification, and this has now begun to be applied across tropical regions, not just in Australia, but also the Indo-Pacific and globally. And what this is showing us is that many past identifications have proven to be incorrect, and it's completely changing our understanding of both oyster diversity and distributions. So just to give you a brief example of this, in literature previously, it was assumed that Secostria glomerata, the Sydney rock oyster, was the main reef building species across all of Northern Australia. We now know that in Queensland and the Northern Territory, it's Secostria lineage B, whereas when we move over to Western Australia, it's Secostria lineage A. Both of these species were previously thought to be Secostria cuculata, which we now know is a species known only from Ascension Island. It is a mess. I'm not going to go into any more detail about that, but just to give a little bit of context as to how confusing and frustrating oyster taxonomy is, and just how little we still know. So thankfully, we are starting to unravel some of these unknowns when it comes to intertidal oysters, but unfortunately, subtidal oysters still largely remain a mystery. And during our site validations, we actually came across some really interesting subtidal reef-building oyster shells, and this triggered a deep dive into us trying to understand what species they could potentially be. And we actually found that, like intertidal oysters, multiple subtidal reef-building oysters have probably been misidentified as well. So this species here is Magellana dactylina, first documented subtidally from Moreton Bay, and it was considered to be a subtidal morph of the Sydney rock oyster. But because it is so, I know I just said that morphology is highly plastic with species, but there are certain shell characteristics that can either assign an oyster to a particular genus or exclude it from that. I won't go into detail on that though. But essentially, because these shells are so morphologically distinct, it is actually recognised as a separate species as Magellana dactylina. And the number of shells that we did find washed up on beaches between especially the Proserpine and Mackay regions strongly suggest that there are subtidal rock oyster reefs in these areas. But as Eric has said, when you are looking subtidally inshore, it's very turbid and it's very challenging to work in these areas with the added complication of big lizards. So this species was known to form mixed species shellfish reefs with other oyster morphs, and these oyster morphs were also assumed to be the Sydney rock oyster. So this pictured here is the drift or dredge oyster, which once formed extensive subtidal reefs on the eastern coast of Australia. It might just look like another plate photo, but this is really exciting because there are actually no published photographs of this species, only sketches. So obtaining these photographs is really, really significant. And this is the first time that I guarantee anyone on this call will be seeing this species. It was originally named Ostrea subtrigona, and it was later synonymized in literature with Secostria glomerata, the Sydney rock oyster, as a subtidal morph. But when we look at these shells, it is, again, lacking certain fundamental shell characteristics, which excludes it from the genus Secostria. So if this is true, then we need to completely rethink what we know about the conservation status and ecology of both the Sydney rock oyster and subtidal rock oyster reefs in Queensland. This opinion piece, which I was really hoping it would be online by today, but I have just finished the proofs for it on Monday. So if you are interested in reading more about this work, it should be online any day now. So stay tuned. So the next steps to sort of address some of these knowledge gaps we have for subtidal oyster reefs. In Southeast Queensland, we are planning to do some subtidal oyster surveys. So we'll be collecting oysters, and while we collect them, we will be trying to assess whether the oysters have reef building capacity. So this will be looking to see if they are settling gregariously or if they are just as free living. Also be identifying these species molecularly. And this is really important because by generating sequences for the subtidal oysters, it will provide baseline data, which will enable future eDNA surveys in tropical regions where at the moment diving is, well, it might be possible, but probably not smart to do that. Generally, future directions, we do need better resolution satellite imagery in the Northern Territory and Western Australia to improve our mapping efforts. And it would also be great to do some more ecological studies on Secostria lineage A to see if it does have similar enough ecology to Secostria lineage B to see if we can repeat the spatial analysis using Queensland reef spatial attributes. And mapping historical reefs is also it poses a significant challenge in a lot of these tropical areas of the Northern Territory and Western Australia. And it will probably need to rely on extensive field surveys, a lot more shell midden analyses, and probably some traditional owner knowledge as well. And finally, mapping subtidal reefs. Well, I think a lot of what Eric has done, that would be a great start. So I was really excited by that talk. And then also, because a lot of it might be more inshore, probably a combination of bathymetry and eDNA. So yeah, thank you all for taking the time to listen to these talks. It's really appreciated. And if anyone has any questions about anything, please feel free to reach out to me. I'm always happy to talk about oysters. And please enjoy these photos of my favorite reefs if anyone has any questions.